This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome particularly to those who are watching this, not just listening, but watching this on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter, because it's the first time I've been able to broadcast the show live to you for some weeks. Well, we didn't have to wait long. 9 o'clock, or 9:05 actually, this morning in Downing Street, Boris was there giving a statement, clearly a Boris that had lost a bit of weight, a Boris that seemed pretty much okay, a Boris that I think we were all pleased to see, but a Boris with a message that wasn't quite what many of us had expected. And I want to debate tonight with you. Has Boris convinced you that lockdown should continue exactly as it is? Before I get to that, of course, we review every day the Downing Street 5 o'clock press conference. Today, chaired by the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, and watching it, covering it for us on LBC was Ben Kentish, our Westminster correspondent. Ben, good evening.
Evening, Nigel.
So, anything surprising come out of today's conference? And where is Matt Hancock on this figure of 100,000 tests by the end of this week?
There was one thing that was surprising that led out to me, and that was the pessimism, frankly, with which Chris Whitty talked about the death toll. When it was put to him that the government's worst case estimate really was 20,000, we've already exceeded that. He didn't try and defend it. He didn't try and say, well, it could have been much higher, which would have been, in effect, the politician's answer. He simply said this has got a long way to run, that we're very much in the first phase, in effect saying he expects that figure to rise significantly, not just in this phase, but in the coming months if we have more and more phases of this virus. I thought that was really stark and really pessimistic, but also perhaps quite honest from the Chief Medical Officer. And yet, again, Nigel, as you touched on, there might be some surprise with which with the way that the government, Matt Hancock then and Boris Johnson this morning, really preparing people, I think, not for a lifting of this lockdown, not even for an easing of it, really. The message they are trying to get across is this is here to stay. Even if they can modify it in some form, Matt Hancock's word, let us all have the resolve to see this through. Given we're expecting a review next week, it doesn't sound to me, from anything that's been said today, like that review is going to result in any significant easing of this lockdown for now.
No, I agree with you. And what was very interesting was Matt Hancock's been under huge pressure over doing 100,000 tests a day by the end of April. And did you notice he mentioned what Boris had said once, some months ago, that we could get to 250,000 tests per day. And there's Matt Hancock saying, well, getting to 250,000 tests could be very difficult. I do wonder whether there's a slight element of the blame game now going on behind the closed doors of Number 10.
Well, we've seen briefings, haven't we, in recent weeks, suggesting that target was dreamt up somewhat arbitrarily by Matt Hancock. That was denied on the record by Boris Johnson's spokesman. They said it was very much a government target. This, of course, Nigel, took place when it seemed that they were almost certain to miss that target. Now, there's still a lot of work to do, let's be clear, but Matt Hancock reiterating today that even though he's only got 3 more days, and even though yesterday only 37,000 tests were carried out, they are still confident, because of the rate at which they're now increasing the testing, that by Thursday they will, perhaps defying a lot of expectations, meet that test. Now, as I say, there's a long way to go. Even Matt Hancock said there's a lot of work to do in those 3 days, but it will be very interesting to see if they get there. But then, of course, as you say, that the question becomes, what next? And it's 6 weeks or so since Boris Johnson came out in the House of Commons in what seems like a different lifetime with that 250,000 figure. And yet Matt Hancock really, as you say, they're refusing to suggest that was still the aim. That would be phenomenally high. And in effect means we would need to have that crucial antibody test that we don't have. And there's a bit of a gulf in testing. You know, is 100,000 enough? When Matt Hancock was asked, is it enough to get in place that crucial track and trace system that he's been talking about, didn't really answer it. So even if he gets there on Thursday, even if he gets there a few days late, we don't really know on testing what comes next and exactly what role it plays in the next phase.
Absolutely.
After the current measures are either eased or kept in place.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. That was Ben Kentish reporting on the press conference with Matt Hancock. So I'd kind of thought maybe we'd see Boris at 5 o'clock today. Maybe Boris Johnson would chair the press conference and take the questions, but no. He did the 9 o'clock, Downing Street, and it was dramatic, and I was very pleased to see him. I'm sure we all were. I personally felt a bit disappointed with the content because I don't think there's any prospect of even the slightest easing, and I think there are some quite strong arguments that say there are some real inconsistencies out there. I'm also disappointed, I suppose, that the Prime Minister didn't take any questions at all. And there are lots of questions, aren't there, about testing, about the number of deaths in care homes and all these things. He didn't take any of them. But look, have a listen to what Boris had to say 9:05 this morning outside the door of number 10.
Thanks to our collective national resolve, we are on the brink of achieving that first clear mission to prevent our National Health Service from being overwhelmed in a way that tragically we have seen elsewhere. And that is how and why we are now beginning to turn the tide. If this virus were a physical assailant, an unexpected and invisible mugger, which I can tell you from personal experience it is, then this is the moment when we have begun together to wrestle it to the floor. And so it follows that this is the moment of opportunity. This is the moment when we can press home our advantage. It is also the moment of maximum risk. We must also recognize the risk of a second spike, the risk of losing control of that virus and letting the reproduction rate go back over 1. Because that would mean not only a new wave of death and disease, but also an economic disaster. And we would be forced once again to slam on the brakes across the whole country and the whole economy, and reimpose restrictions in such a way as to do more and lasting damage. And so I know it is tough, and I want to get this economy moving as fast as I can, but I refuse to throw away all the effort and the sacrifice of the British people, and to risk a second major outbreak and huge loss of life and the overwhelming of the NHS. I can tell you now that preparations are underway and have been for weeks to allow us to win phase 2 of this fight, as I believe we are now on track to prevail in phase 1. And so I say to you finally, if you can keep going in the way that you have kept going so far, if you can help protect our NHS to save lives, and if we as a country can show the same spirit of optimism and energy shown by Captain Tom Moore, who turns 100 this week, if we can show the same spirit of unity and determination as we have all shown in the past 6 weeks, then I have absolutely no doubt that we will beat it together. We will come through this all the faster, and the United Kingdom will emerge stronger than ever before.
Well, that was Boris Johnson this morning. He's certainly right to say that the NHS has not been overwhelmed. In fact, there are tens of thousands of empty beds at the Nightingale hospitals. A great testimony to the army and others that have put them up are basically empty. So we have got lots of NHS capacity. We've got room in intensive care units. Yes, the lockdown has achieved that. But when he said this is the moment of opportunity, I thought, wow, we're really going to have a proper debate here about the way forward and a light at the end of the tunnel. And bear in mind that virtually every other country is having an ongoing conversation with people about how you begin to ease lockdown. And then he said no, because it's also the moment of maximum risk. I have to say I was a bit disappointed in that. I completely understand that social distancing should be maintained. I'm not even saying end the lockdown now, but I am saying that he didn't convince me that we should keep the lockdown as it is. Did he convince you? You tell me. Well, Jay in Aberdeen says she totally agrees with Boris and the lockdown. John in Maidstone says, I agree with Boris. The lockdown needs to continue, but I thought he might throw us a small bone at least. John, that's what I was looking for. I was looking for a conversation about how we move on from here, not to be told we'll stick here for at least a couple of weeks and not have that conversation. That, of course, may change. So let me know your thoughts. 0345 6060 973. You can text to 84850, tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And those of you back with me watching on YouTube, Twitter and Facebook, you can put in questions too. It is now 16 minutes past 6. Time for the news headlines with Bill. At the crisis, normal politics does, of course, continue. And in a few weeks' time, Germany will take over the rotating presidency of the European Council. Yes, I know they've got a permanent president after the Lisbon Treaty. That's currently Belgium. But a country gets a 6-month term at being in the chair. So it'll be Angela Merkel from July the 1st that'll be in the chair, and she set out her plan for Germany's 6 months. She wants to impose a financial transaction tax, put in place minimum tax rates across the European Union, have a harmonised corporate taxation so that no country like Ireland could choose its own lower corporate tax rate, and aim for an EU-wide healthcare system. So it is, under Merkel, full steam ahead for a United States of Europe with Germans as the top dogs. And thank goodness we left on the 31st of January. And I hope we can get the next phase over as quickly as possible. All the reasons the people who voted Brexit are backed up by what Mrs. Merkel wants to do in that 6-month period. Nigel, the way you talk about lockdown is surprising. It seems to me there are still people who don't realise how serious it is. Wake up and get in the real world. Paul, I realise how serious it is. 2 close family members have had this. One has been really seriously very ill with it. Luckily, I'm pleased to say is recovering. And when we talk, I'm not talking about scrapping lockdown and getting the pubs open. I mean, fun though that might be in some ways. I'm not talking about getting rid of social distancing. In fact, I'd like to go further. I'd like to see us, like many other countries, saying we should use face masks, wear disposable gloves, etc. What I am saying, and I'm going to say it again, I think it's utterly ridiculous that the local garden centre is closed. We queue up to go into supermarkets. We do it in a disciplined way. There's no reason why we can't do it with things like garden centres and other businesses out there, some small, some larger. And Paul, you know, if this lockdown goes on forever, I wonder just what kind of country it'll be at the end of it. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Let's go to Oxford and speak to Leslie, who's a new caller. Leslie, good evening.
Good evening. I've been enjoying your debate on the coronavirus.
Good.
Yeah, I was listening to. I'm not a great fan of Boris Johnson,
but it was nice to see him back nonetheless, Leslie, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was nice to see him back. The message that came across to me, I thought it was quite positive in a way. Well, encouraging in the way to kind of, what was I going to say? To kind of hang on there. We'll get through this together if you bear with us. That was the message that came through to me.
Yes, okay, but wouldn't it be nice to sort of at least have a conversation with people about what they're thinking and where we might be going? And
I agree there should be more transparency without a doubt. There should be more testing. Definitely.
Yes,
yeah.
and Leslie, the other thing, can I say, is that by doing it in that way, as opposed to chairing the 5 o'clock Downing Street press conference, it meant he didn't have to take any questions.
Yeah, I can see that. You maybe in the next few days see what happens as the week goes on.
Yeah, look, it's his first day back. Leslie, it's his first day back, and I'm not going mad about it. I'm just saying I'm slightly disappointed. You know, I'd felt that government was on hold for the last couple of weeks. And frankly, look, let's be honest, he's more of a president than a prime minister. I mean, he's much better than any of the rest of them. At least he's got some personality and a bit of fizz.
At least he doesn't get us to take bleach.
Well, what did you make of his hair colour today?
I didn't quite see the hair. I mean, I just read the post.
It looked a bit whiter, but you know, hey, look, he was back looking healthy, but I wanted something a bit more optimistic. That's all I'm saying, Leslie. But I thank you very much indeed for your call. Boris should have made lockdown more stringent, I get. Well, fine, if that's really what you think. I wonder, those that want this stringent lockdown, how long do they want it for? I mean, this is not just a health crisis now. It's actually a health and an economic crisis, and I think we need to recognise that. Paul from Preston says, Nigel, I think the government should be planning their exit strategy. I think we should gradually ease the measures and have phases to restart the economy. The barbers will have to be reopened at some point. I don't want to end up with hair looking like Boris. Very, very good. The trouble with Boris relaxing the lockdown is that it might send the green light to lots of people who would see it as a free-for-all, and that would endanger life. Look, okay, I understand this argument. We don't want mixed messages. But if people are treated as grown-ups, then I think they would actually abide by rules as they begin to change, as most people have done already. Let's go to an old regular caller to the show, Ben in Bristol. Good evening to you.
Seems like so long, Nigel. Seems like the world's been upside down since we last spoke.
Well, we've talked about
Brexit.
I know.
All this happened.
I know. So what did you make of Boris today, Ben?
Boris, God bless him, he's glad he's alive, but I'm not quite sure who he was channeling, whether it was Winston Churchill or Neville Chamberlain today. It was a bit of both, wasn't it? It was a bit of fluff and bluster, a bit of fight. Also got
We'll come back to you, Ben. That line's awful. Goodbye. Let's go to Cardiff and speak to Jason, a new caller. Jason, good evening.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm all right, Jason. I wanted a bit more hope today than we got, but maybe I'm too much of an optimist, Jason.
You and me both. My call's more of a doom and gloom. I'm not convinced that the government has done a great job, to be frank.
No, well, nor am I, really.
My reasons being is I think failing to give the frontline staff adequate PPE just helps spread the virus in our society. Because obviously that's like a war zone, and that's where all the major the virus is, I suppose. I'm also a firm believer that failing to give adequate tests also contributes to the virus spreading in society. Mm-hmm. I just think they failed on so many levels.
What about flights, Jason? What about the hundreds of thousands of people that have flown back without a single basic test or any insistence on quarantining?
I'm with you 1,000,000%, because I mean, I was listening to Matt Hancock on the news earlier on, and he just contradicted himself, saying it's not a big problem. But on the second hand, he said when the rate of infection comes down, they'll then look at that as being a problem.
Yeah. Well, that, of course, is, I guess, their plan to deal with when they do ease lockdown, trying to stop a big peak coming back. But no, look, Jason, I'm with you. I think they've been behind the curve on all of this from the very start. And we want to believe in our government in a time of crisis, but the evidence, I'm afraid, does not stack up behind them. But I tell you what, Jason, however disappointed you are in the government, and I am too, I've got more confidence in Boris than I've got in the rest.
I feel sorry for Boris. I think he got dealt a bad hand, if that makes sense, because he's been advised by scientific advisors. Now, from the research I've done, they're all in the pocket of Bill Gates.
Well, Bill Gates is certainly influential, and some could argue the Chinese are very influential, and we could go on with that debate. But Jason, thanks for the call. I understand your disappointment. And, he talked there, Jason, about Matt Hancock. So Hancock, of course, is responsible for the nation's health and well-being. And from the start of the coronavirus pandemic, he's been right in the middle of this. Now, tomorrow morning, he'll be with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. He will be there from 8 p.m. taking your calls for half an hour. So if you want to put your questions in the Health Secretary, you can call in tomorrow morning, 0345 6060 973, or you can email now a question if you want to nick@lbc.co.uk. nick@lbc.co.uk. So you either call the usual number, you can send an email in, and believe me, when you get to put your question to Matt Hancock, unlike that stage-managed farce today where they said members of the public are asking questions, Hancock will not know what the question is before Nick Ferrari puts it through you to him. So please have a go. Let's go back to Bristol and see how Ben is. Ben, hi.
There's always a second chance, Nigel, isn't there?
Hello there. Yeah, well, the second chance for Boris, of course, in every sense.
Yeah.
Coming back from illness.
Second chance for life.
Second chance at life. I'm sure he's thrilled with that. I'm also sure he must have a lot on his mind. He's got a fiancée who's got COVID-19, a baby on the way. I mean, there's a lot on his plate. But I just wanted a bit more today, Ben. What did you make of it?
I sort of thought he was half channeling Winston Churchill and half channeling Neville Chamberlain. He wasn't sure whether to leap into the all guns blazing or the very cautious, pragmatic Boris. But I worry about the people he's got around him, Nigel. I worry about people like Neil Ferguson, telling us he told us 500,000 people were going to die about 4 weeks ago. And now this same advisor is telling us if we all go back to work, 100,000 people are going to die. And I think he needs some different voices going around him so he can get a more balanced and positive appraisal. I'm troubled by this whole thing, Nigel. I'm troubled by what we've been through as a nation. Yeah, media, the terror we've been put through. I mean, it's good to be cautious, but I mean, you click on that show in the morning with Piers Morgan, you see the virus pulsing in the background every day. I mean, wouldn't it be different if we saw an antibody or a white blood cell first thing in the morning?
So a bit more positivity, Ben. Is that what you want to see?
Yeah, I think we've been corporately terrorised. People don't need much encouragement to do the lockdown where I live. They're very, very strict about it. I think probably most across the country are really, really terrified by this. But there's actually, now I'm not taking these deaths lightly. I take the virus seriously, but we've plateaued the curve for about 10 days. And this week, the numbers seem to be really coming down. So you have to begin a narrative now about starting to open things up.
I think we do. And Ben, we also have to face a horrible reality, which is this thing will not just die out completely. It is going to come back in the autumn in some way. Ben, thank you for your call. It is now 6:31. Time for the news with Bill Overton. Brexit, of course, does not go away, and today Michael Gove was appearing before the Brexit Select Committee, and following this for LBC was Matthew Thompson. What sort of form was Michael Gove in today, Matthew?
Well, Nigel, first of all, I'm sure you've been following it assiduously, but your listeners may be forgiven for potentially taking their eyes off the Brexit ball in recent weeks. It's probably worth a reminder of where we are. Not all is not particularly well in Brexit land, you might conservatively say, Nigel. There have been just 2 rounds of negotiations since we left the EU in January, and the last one, which finished last week, let's say it didn't end particularly well. And of course, we've got that June deadline if we're going to extend the transition period. So Michael Gove was on robust form, trying to answer some of the questions that were put to him on the committee, but he was also not up for giving much away. His evidence was what you might say light on detail, perhaps, Nigel. The evidence focused on 2 main themes, the various stumbling blocks in those negotiations, and then, of course, inevitably, the impact of coronavirus on Brexit, because we know coronavirus is all-consuming. So Mr. Gove, first of all, he accepted that limited progress has been made in these negotiations. That's potentially putting it mildly. But he said he was confident that in spite of everything, in spite of coronavirus, the current timetable for the transition period to end at the end of this year is appropriate. He repeatedly said that deadlines focused minds, and he said that actually far from delaying the negotiations, as many of his opponents think we should do, the coronavirus crisis should actually concentrate the minds of EU negotiators on coming to a swift conclusion. But he did admit one interesting thing, Nigel. He said that some 47 civil servants have been currently redeployed from Brexit negotiations to coronavirus. Now, there's 2 things in that. There's the word currently and also Brexit negotiations. So you wonder about, of course, over the course of the several weeks, and also implementation of Brexit as separate from negotiations. So 47, even to me, sounds like that might be a conservative estimate. But if you think about that, the amount of energy of the civil servants has been diverted away from Brexit, it doesn't make it sound like that we're necessarily in the best place to be running a negotiating strategy concurrent to this all-consuming coronavirus crisis.
Interesting. Matthew, thank you very much indeed. And Gove, he does talk a big talk. I mean, today he said something that I thought was very interesting. He said, the EU quite rightly says you can't have the same rights outside the EU, without the obligations of being inside it. Well, he says, why does that logic not apply to fishing? Well, they seem to think they can go on fishing in our waters. So saying lots of good things, but Michel Barnier being pretty stroppy at the end of last week. We will see where we go. But remember, if we extend then we stay part of the single market rules. We're not able to sign our own trade deals. This is a big deal for the government. Right, back to Boris today. We're all pleased to see him back. Did he convince you that the lockdown must continue as it is? Richard says, Nigel, you don't have access to all the information, so stop taking cheap shots at the government. I'll tell you what I do have, Richard. I've got access to what every other government in the world that has faced this crisis has done. And many of them have done a damn sight better than we've done. Testing, isolating, tracing, all those things that the Germans did, the South Koreans did, stopping flights coming in, checking people coming in. Almost every country in the world has done that apart from us. And when you actually look, Richard, at the death rates, and when we get a bit more transparency, and the care home deaths come in, you'll see that we will have performed worse than any other country in the world. I think it is right to be critical. I genuinely do. Restrictions should only be lifted, says Chris in London, when there have been 0 deaths for 7 days, unless people want a second wave. No, Chris, we don't want a second wave. But if you listen to the virologists, they tell us it's likely we will have many waves of this over the years to come, but hopefully we'll be in a position where we have a vaccine to deal with it. The idea that this virus is completely going to disappear, I think, is for the birds. Let's go to Cardiff again and speak to Leanne. Leanne, good evening to you.
Hi, I'm not actually in Cardiff. I'm in London.
Are you? Never mind. We all make mistakes. So, what did you make of Boris? What did you make of Boris today?
Well, I was glad to see him back.
Yes, so was I.
I'm glad that he looks a lot better. I hope he still takes it easy because he's been through a lot. As much as I want to see a slight breaking of the lockdown so that the economy can recover and small businesses can start to function again, I do understand his reticence and his fear because, like me, he lives and he works in central London, and my only shock, Nigel, is I've looked around me on overcrowded tubes and buses for years now, and I'm almost in wonderment now that this hasn't ever happened before, because I just so when I look back, that what we put up with on the overcrowded tubes and buses to get to work in London, it gets worse and worse every year, and it's almost become impossible on the tubes. And to think that this has happened now and never happened before is almost unbelievable.
Well, we have had, Leanne, we have had big outbreaks in the past
but not like this.
We've had winter flus, in decades gone past that have been serious, and you get and you do get big bouts of the common cold too, don't you? But Leanne, I understand what you say. The trouble is, in practical terms, it's difficult to see a London where it's not crowded, isn't it?
But I wanted to throw a curveball and just say, the way they shut down certain regions in other countries in Europe, they tried to do a lockdown regionally. Could we break the lockdown regionally?
Of course. Of course we could. Of course we could. We could say, look, the southwest of England, Devon, Cornwall, Somerset, Dorset, Gloucestershire, whatever, we could say, look, actually, the number of cases, the number of reinfections in that region is really quite low, and we're going to begin an easing in an area like that. We could certainly do that, Leanne. Of course we could. The government are worried that it'll send a mixed message and everybody will go mad. But I think we're more grown up than that, unless I'm being a bit naive.
Well, hopefully we've learned a lot over the last few weeks, and people will be sensible and just say, let's do a test in a quieter area, see if it works, see if infections stay down, see if people behave themselves. Even treat us like children. If you behave yourselves and this works, we'll give you more. But like Angela Merkel did, she said, if you don't do this, we'll go back. So
that's what Alan, I agree with you. A regional approach is not an unrealistic way of approaching this. Thank you very much. Nigel, when's the last time you were in a grocery store? Well, actually quite recently. There are way too many stupid people who think the 2-metre rule only applies to front and back rubbing shoulders. To front and back. Rubbing shoulders up and down the aisles is okay, right? So they're not perfect in supermarkets is what you're saying. Another one's saying, have you been to a supermarket? There's no social distancing. It's a free-for-all. COVID-idiots everywhere. Boris didn't have to convince me. I'm glad he's got the sense to continue it, says Lisa in Northampton. I guess it depends what supermarket you go to and how many people are in it. What I've seen has, I have to say, been very responsible on Twitter. I agree. We should have quarantined right from the start. I am so angry they let people mingle and spread the virus. Look, Boris is better than his ministers. They do seem to be lacking in experience. And his freshly washed hair was the star, says Angela. Right. It hadn't changed colour. It was freshly washed. Perhaps that's the answer to what I was posing earlier. And Mark in Newbury says, look, I agree, Nigel. Get garden centres open. People can start painting their fences. And that might stop them being tempted to go outside. They'll stay at home. Well, all I can tell you is that the rest of this week is not going to be good for painting and outdoor DIY, because after 6 of the driest weeks we've ever had, the rain starts right across the country tomorrow. Let us go to Hexham in Northumberland and speak to Mark, who's a new caller. Mark, good evening.
How you doing? It's good to speak to you.
Good to speak to you. So, what did you think of Boris today? Quite perky in a way.
Well, yes, but, we don't need a cheerleader at this particular point. What we need is a leader. We need a leader to implement a staged regional opening of the economy and to get the test, trace, and isolate game figured out.
Yeah.
And once we've got that, we're going to be able to get rid of this shutdown. And as long as you got the trace, testing, and isolation capability, and this has been shown as the tried and true way to get through this problem. And South Korea and Germany are showing the way here. But, there is no question that we're going to have a second peak. The question is, how big is that peak going to be?
Absolutely. Mark, I agree with that. We're not going to stop this thing completely. How big is it going to be? And look, I'm not arguing for the end of lockdown completely. I'm arguing for an easing. But you're absolutely right. The only safe way we can do this and stop a second huge peak is testing, tracing, and isolating. It's the only way, Mark, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, the situation that we've got now is based, the 4 areas of harm that have been created to the people here and the economy here are all based on the government's policy. The COVID-19 situation was handled poorly. We got hospital deaths, care home deaths, and residence deaths that add up to, according to Whitty's numbers and other estimations, we're absolutely at 40,000 right now.
I think we're probably very close to that number, Mark. No, I do.
Absolutely.
I do. No, I do. Mark, so you were disappointed today?
Very much so. We hear too much of this repetitive stuff, and it's starting to backfire on them now. The whole stay at home and protect the NHS. People are dying all over the country because they're scared to go to the NHS. And
they're talking about
when he said this about 2 or 3 weeks ago, he let the number slip of 5,000 extra deaths. I call them collateral damage that's happening because people are not going to get the care they need.
I know, and the irony, Mark, is we've got almost 40,000 empty hospital beds, although, to be fair, a lot of those have been put aside in Nightingale hospitals. Mark, thank you for your call. And Mark is right. The only way we can safely, completely open up is to have a test, trace, and isolate policy for the country. Logistically, that is an absolutely massive thing for the government to do. So the complete, full easing and return to normality, I'm not under any illusions, it's a very long way off. But I do think an easing is quite important, and we should at least be looking towards that light at the end of a tunnel. I don't think Boris did that this morning. This is the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:46. Time for the news headlines with Bill Overton. I commented a few weeks ago about minute silences taking place all over Italy as a mark of respect and honouring those that had died. And tomorrow at 11 a.m, there is going to be a tribute to those that have died battling this pandemic, and Boris Johnson is going to lead it. Minute silence from 11 o'clock tomorrow, and remembering those that died, particularly frontline NHS workers and, of course, care workers. And I just wonder how many of you had actually heard of this, because if we're going to do a minute silence across the country, surely it needs lots and lots of publicity, a little bit of planning, and it seems this one has appeared very, very rapidly out of left field, and I suspect it won't be followed by the numbers that perhaps it ought to be. But I don't know. You tell me. Are you like me and have heard very little about this today? Let's get back to Boris this morning. Let's go to Nigel in Aylesbury, a new caller. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Nigel, Mr. Brexit. Pleasure talking to you.
Good to talk to you.
It's been a long time wanting to get on your show. Anyway,
you have to persevere to get through sometimes, but you've got through. You're on LBC, so give us your rundown of what you made of Boris's speech this morning.
Well, he looked a picture of health, really. He's obviously got to take it easy, but it was a pleasure to see him back at the forefront of the government. I think he's been sadly missed, I really do, because I think he's head and shoulders above anything in his party, to be fair.
I agree.
And in my opinion, I just feel as though we've got a proper leader now leading the country. And I think my own opinion is, you can tell I'm a big Boris fan and a big fan of yourself, and I was a Brexit supporter as well, sort of thing. Followed you and supported you. You've done a good thing for the country. And also, I really do think, give it a week or two, and I think we will start to get some direction of where we're really going. We're a totally different country to Spain, to Italy, to Germany. We're densely populated. I can appreciate that, and you've got, just imagine if we'd have had Corbyn, Diane Abbott, Keir Starmer leading all this. Heavens of God.
Well, who knows? Who knows what they'd have done? Look, I tell you what, Nigel, I agree with you. It was great to see Boris back. I agree with you. He's 100 times better than nearly all the rest of them that we've had to see at some of these agonising 5 o'clock daily press conferences since he's been away. And it's because of that I was a little bit disappointed not to get a bit more content today. But, Nigel, maybe you're right. Maybe we'll hear it in the coming days. Thank you very much indeed for your support and for your call. Terry in Manchester says, Boris was disappointing this morning. Maybe he should do a press conference just with members of the public to see how they feel instead of just listening to his ministers. I agree with you, Nigel, says Terry in Broxbourne. Disappointed with Boris. Same old words, no forward thinking. Nobody has got time to rectify this. Nigel, I'm more than happy to social distance. I'm more than happy to go to work to help fund the NHS. I'm more than happy to pay welfare for those who wish to stay at home. However, I will not tolerate being dictated to on how to spend my leisure time social distancing by those I'm funding to stay at home. End the lockdown, says Lauken in Stevenage. Look, Lauken, I think there are lots of things in terms of outdoor activities that should be eased and eased pretty quickly because you can do them and social distance, and that's part of the nonsense of where we are. And that's what makes some people very, very angry. Let's go to Southampton and speak to James. James, a new caller. Good evening to you.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm
Hope
all
you're not
right.
affected by this terrible beast from the east.
No, I've been very, very lucky. I mean, as I said, I've had two family members, close family members who have had it. So, you know, I'm aware of how horrid it is, James, and done my best to avoid it. And I was one of the early ones, James, saying we should lock down and buy ourselves some time. But I think we need to be given a bit of a roadmap, a bit of a light at the end of a tunnel, James. That's my feeling.
Yeah, that's the thing is that I think you're right about I think a lot of people would do with garden centres, once their crop's gone, let's put it that way, it's gone. You know, it doesn't last. It's not something you can hide away in a warehouse and we'll sell that a little bit later on. You can't do that with garden centres.
Well, unless they open, James, a lot of this stuff, unless they open soon, a lot of these plants are just going to get dumped, aren't they?
Exactly. It's just going to get dumped and they're going to lose millions at it. So, you know, the thing is, just take a bit of a sensible view on something like that and say, well, we can have social distances. They will act responsibly. I'm sure they would anyway. Otherwise, there's a case of people will be complaining and say, look, they're just running riot. They're not allowing these people to act in a responsible manner.
Do you think, James, where you live,
yeah.
do you think, I get conflicting reports. I get some people saying everyone's behaving. I get some people saying their local supermarket people aren't behaving. I mean, what's your impression of how we've managed over the last month?
Well, to be quite honest, the shopping has been done by our children because we have really self-isolated.
Right.
So I couldn't really tell you what's happening. I've seen the lines queuing up outside the supermarket. It seems to be done in a responsible manner. People seem to be dissing themselves from one another, but what's actually happening inside the stores, I couldn't give a report on that. I've heard it's a little bit of a free-for-all, but I couldn't say that for all the stores, whether that was just a case of...
Well, I guess it's some and some. James, would you like to see an easing of this lockdown over the next couple of weeks?
I think we've got to be a bit more responsible than that. I'd love to see it easing off, but it's like everything. I think Boris is back in the chair now. That's good. So he will be listening, like all of us, like all of the people that's been in there before. They will be listening to the medical advice. And I think they've obviously done that in the past. And that's the way we've reached our situation we're at the moment. The one thing that's really got up my nose, and I've seen it going on at ferry ports, I've seen it going on trains, and I've seen it done at Heathrow, all the airports that have got people coming in from God knows where, all points cease, let's put it that way, heavily infected areas, and there's no checks on them.
I know.
And that's for that lot that's streaming across the channel.
I know, James, it drives me mad. It drives me mad, and we're doing nothing about it.
I don't believe it. I thought it was... I had to check the date when I saw a piece in the Mail the other day, and I thought it was April the 1st.
I know.
And they were picking these. I mean, I feel sorry for them.
It's just...
These poor devils up. But we cannot take on the misery of the world.
We're now, James, we're now effectively... The Border Force is now effectively a taxi service. That you leave Calais or somewhere on the north coast of France, you leave the coast, you get a few miles, and we then ferry you in. It's crazy. James, thank you very much indeed for your call. Brett in Leighton says, I cannot for the life of me see what the difference having Boris back makes. Is he some kind of messiah who's going to make everything better? I don't get it. Brett, he may not be a messiah, but nearly, and there are one or two exceptions. I think Rishi Sunak is pretty capable and pretty able. Some of the others, Brett, in our cabinet are amongst the lowest grade people you would ever meet in your life. They are hopeless. They are just career politicians without principle, without leadership, dull as ditch water. They read from a script. They never answer a question. And the point, Brett, about Boris is he's 1,000 times better than that lot added up, put together and multiplied by 10. Anne is delighted to see Boris back. But she says maybe we can learn a lot from South Africa. They were quick to shut the country down. So far, only 100 deaths. They've strictly controlled access to the country, unlike us, who lets everyone in. Vietnam, an even more dramatic example. I've got time for one last call. It's Phil in Aylesbury, a new caller. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Thanks for taking the call.
Not a bit. So what do you make of it?
Yeah, well, I thought it was good to see him back, but I don't think he's got a plan. That's the trouble.
Oh, dear.
I mean, it seems to me that survival of the business, in my view, survival of the business is paramount. And it seems to me at the beginning we had a choice for either lockdown like China or South Korea and test everybody and have masks on. And it seems to me we've done a lockdown, but I think we'll end up with more people dead here and the biggest unemployment in Europe. That's the problem. We got the worst of both worlds, I think.
I fear you might be right, because it looks like the rest of Europe is starting to ease out of the lockdown. And it looks like we're going to be stuck in it for longer, which means more economic harm. Although, Phil, we may have this conversation in 6 months' time and compare who had the bigger second peak and how big it was. Phil, thanks for your call. Thanks to all of you for listening. Thanks to those of you tonight who've been watching. I'm back tomorrow at 6, at 10 tonight. It's Tom Swarbrick. Right now, it's Ian Dale.